I have the great fortune of being the moderator of this panel this afternoon looking at the DSM-5. I'm Barbara Russell. I work as the bioethicist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, as well as I'm associated with the University of Toronto's Joint Center for Bioethics. And who is peopling the panel this afternoon, so let me just introduce you to them, things that they've told me about themselves as well as things I've uncovered online. So first, to my very far left is Julie Aultman, who has a PhD in philosophy and cognitive sciences and an MA in bioethics. She works as an associate professor in family community medicine at Northeast Ohio Medical University. She is also, I think importantly, an advocate for patients with autism and their families, works at group homes for adults with developmental disabilities, and she's very interested, I noticed when I was reading about her, very interested in classification schemes. Beside her is Peter Whitehouse, who's a physician and has a PhD as well as an MA in bioethics. He's a staff neurologist at the Brain Health and Memory Center at University Hospitals of Cleveland. He's a professor as well of neurology at Case Western Reserve University. Something else I learned about him in talking to him this morning is that he's a professor of various departments at the University of Toronto, interestingly working with the University of Toronto departments on strategic innovations. And in 2008, I noted that he had published a book titled The Myth of Alzheimer's, What You Aren't Being Told. And then to my immediate left is Serife Tekin, who has a PhD in philosophy. Her dissertation was on how psychiatric diagnosis shapes personal identity. And a member of her dissertation committee, lucky her I think, was Ian Hacking from the University of Toronto. So that makes it interesting as well. She did, after her PhD, she went to the university, to Dalhousie University in Halifax and did a postdoctoral fellowship with the NeuroEthics group there. And now she's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Pittsburgh Center for the Philosophy of Science. So we've got a really heterogeneous group here to get into this whole issue of thinking about the DSM-5. So when I wanted to share this to you, just kind of framing the discussion, because I mean, obviously the DSM-5 is big, is articles that I was reading about the debate of where we're going with the DSM-5. There's a number of great articles, I think it ended up being 85 pages long, that's published in the Bulletin of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry in 2010. And one of the quotes that was written by Alan Francis, who was the person who headed up the DSM-4, because this whole debate about thinking about what are the DSMs, let alone what is DSM-5. And the way he characterized this, I think, is kind of intriguing. He says, well, first, there's the first empire. And that person says there are balls and there are strikes, and I call them as they are. Then there's the second empire. There are balls and there are strikes, and I call them as I see them. And then there's the third empire. There are no balls and there are no strikes until I call them. So again, he's using this to really kind of illuminate what is psychiatric diagnosis. And then the question that I pose to the panelists is two simple ones. It's easy to write simple questions, the answers, isn't it? So this is what I pose them just to get the conversation going. I'm going to give each of them 10 minutes of their reflections on these two questions. Then I could be a bit hard on this, but part of it is to make this a discussion. So keep them to their 10 minutes. Then I'm hoping they will talk amongst themselves of just what they heard each other say. And then we're going to open it up for your conversation and reflections on the DSM-5. So these are the questions I posed to them. And I wanted to kind of start from the ethics framework since we're a neuroethics conference. So compared to the DSM-4, how will the DSM-5 be ethically stronger in any way? And then compared to the DSM-4, how will the DSM-5 be ethically either weaker or more worrisome in any way? So Serife, would you mind just starting off with your 10 minutes of your reflections on these two questions?
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this really exciting panel. And as a philosopher, I want to first take us back to the basics of psychiatric classification and psychiatric taxonomy, and the DSMs in particular. I want to highlight that it is important to see the DSM for what it is. The DSM is merely a tool used for a variety of purposes in psychiatry, including research, diagnosis, treatment, administration, forensics, insurance, benefits, in the military, as we heard from the previous panelist. And as a tool, can the DSM be ethically strong or weak, to respond to Barbara's question? Well, consider another tool first, say a knife. It would be misguided to talk about whether a knife is ethically strong or worrisome without considering what we use the knife for. I may use a knife to slice up a piece of bread and share it with my friends. This would be an ethical practice. I would be using the tool to increase the well-being of a group of individuals. Alternatively, I may use the same knife to murder someone. In this case, I would be using the tool for unethical purposes. My use will result in harm. Similarly, the ethical strengths and weaknesses of the proposed DSM-5 are to be determined by considering how the manual is used. Thus, it is imperative for us to first gauge the purposes of the DSM taxonomy and then contemplate on how the DSMs, and in particular the DSM-5, may lead to ethical or unethical practices. My main argument is that the fundamental source of the harms conflicted by the DSMs lies in their ambitious nature. Mental disorder categories in the DSM are designed to serve a multitude of purposes or interests in psychiatry, and some of these interests are incompatible with each other. Due to these incompatibilities, the same feature of a DSM category can yield to ethical practices in one context and unethical practices in another context. Let me explain. So what are the purposes of the DSM? So I basically benefited from the previous DSM manual's introductions to respond to this question. The DSM is a classification manual of mental disorders. It sorts mental disorders into categories according to the symptoms that patients display. What are these categories? Categories like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. The DSM categories are created for pragmatic reasons. Psychiatry, as a branch of medicine, aims to alleviate the burden of mental disorders on individuals so affected. Thus, the aim of the psychiatric inquiry is not only to explain what kinds of things are mental disorders, but also to predict the behavior of those individuals with mental disorders and make timely, therapeutic, effective interventions to improve their conditions. And the diagnostic categories are therefore the building blocks of research, diagnosis, and treatment in psychiatry. As it is explicit in the DSM-4 introduction, for instance, DSM categories are designed and used for a multitude of purposes, and these are the ones that are listed in the DSM-4. First, the symptom-based categories are intended to be useful for the clinician in diagnosing the patient's condition. Second, the categories of mental disorders are intended to facilitate research. How? For instance, in conducting research on mental disorder etiology, neuroscientists may select a group of individuals with the same diagnosis and visualize and measure activity in their brains by using various imaging technologies. Third, these categories are intended to guide and facilitate research into effective treatment methods. For instance, whether or not psychotropic agents are effective is tested in clinical trials among the subjects who share the same diagnosis. The same applies to testing how a certain type of psychotherapy, such as cognitive behavior therapy, compares to psychopharmacological treatment. DSM manuals are also used for various administrative, educational, insurance-related, and forensic purposes. So the DSM has a wide scope of application. And I want to illustrate how the multiple ways in which the DSMs are used may give rise to ethical and unethical practices. And I want to demonstrate that by focusing on one proposed change in the DSM-5. So the proposal is that in the DSM-5 Working Committee on Mood Disorders proposed that we remove the bereavement exclusion criterion from the major depression diagnosis. So according to the current criteria, according to the DSM-4, the individual deviating from her previous functioning must present at least 5 of the listed symptoms during a 2-week period to be diagnosed with major depression. So it is required for the depression diagnosis that the person has either the depressed mood or the loss of interest or pleasure among the 5 symptoms that she needs to meet. And the rest of the various symptoms that in the list includes depressed mood, diminished interest in and pleasure from daily activities, significant weight gain or loss, insomnia, hypersomnia, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness and guilt, recurrent thoughts of death, and suicidal ideation. So in the current DSM, it is indicated explicitly that if any of these symptoms are accounted for by bereavement, that is, if the person is actually grieving and encountering these symptoms, we should not give the person depression diagnosis. And the DSM-IV places a 2-month cap, 2-month limit on bereavement. If individuals' depression-like symptoms upon a loss of a loved one last more than 2 months after the loss, the depression diagnosis should not be made. So go back in history in DSM-III, that limit was up to 1 year. So with the proposed DSM-V, the proposal is to get rid of the bereavement exclusion criterion altogether from the diagnostic criteria for depression. And the fundamental argument for this change, for this proposal, is that the available evidence does not support distinguishing bereavement from other kinds of depression. And if the proposal is accepted, the DSM-V will individuate grief-related emotional struggle following a significant loss as depression by highlighting the symptoms that resemble a depressive episode. So what is the motivation for this? The DSM-V task force chair, David Kupfer, reported to the New York Times that the change would allow psychiatrists to treat people who are suffering so that they will get the treatment they need. So the idea is to help grieving individuals. So let's consider how this proposed change can yield to both ethical and unethical practices depending on what the DSM-V is used for. And I will focus in particular the diagnostic, treatment, and research contexts. So if this change occurs, psychiatrists will diagnose the individual who experiences sadness, disturbed sleep, agitation, difficulty concentrating, all the symptoms of depression that follow the loss of a significant one as having depression. So with this diagnosis, psychiatrists may recommend the grieving individual that her symptoms be addressed with pharmacological agents or psychotherapy or with a combination of both. And this practice has ethical implications. The psychiatrist will have to gauge which treatment may be the most beneficial for that individual by focusing on this individual's particular traits and needs and evaluating the meaning of loss for this person with the goal of helping the person negotiate the demands of the world without that loud person in it. And in an attempt to reduce the symptoms, however, the psychiatrist may also prescribe medication, but if the medication ends up having more side effects than having positive impact on improving the patient's condition, then it may result with more harm than good. So this is an ethical decision. And the DSM-V will also be used for research on depression. I can foresee clinical trials in which depressed individuals and those who are grieving will be put in the same group because arguably there is no difference between the symptoms displayed by these two groups. But this may misdirect the research. Perhaps what constitutes an effective treatment will differ even if the symptoms are the same. Thus, the proposed change has ethical implications in the context of research as well. So one might argue, for instance, that due to the nature of complex experience like grief, psychotherapy may offer resources to the individual that pharmacological treatment fails to offer. For example, psychotherapy, due to its interactive and supportive nature, may help the individual develop strategies to live in the world without the loved one in it. But this is an empirical question, and we need to make sure that we explore this venue of research. This line of research may not be encouraged, again, due to the multiple uses of the DSM. For instance, due to the availability of funding from psychotropic drug companies, the research on treatment of grief-related depression may focus on developing psychopharmacological agents that aim at symptom reduction in lieu of researching the effects of psychotherapy, such as cognitive behavior therapy. And this will yield to unethical consequences because we will not be actively exploring a venue of treatment that can actually benefit many individuals. Hence, the multitude of purposes for which the DSM manuals are used paints a complex picture. If we want to evaluate the harms and benefits of the proposed changes, it is imperative that we focus on these purposes. For instance, a prima facie positive change in the DSM under the rubric of helping individuals who suffer from grief may in fact have harmful consequences, or political and economic interest in psychiatric research may override patients' best interests. So, ending with my original metaphor, it is important for psychiatry to create a diagnostic manual that is like a multi-bladed Swiss Army knife, with each blade used for a different purpose, and it's only then we can minimize the harms inflicted by psychiatric taxonomies.
Thank
That's
you,
all I have to
Serife.
say.
You were great at staying within the 10 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you.
So, Peter, can I turn it over to you for your thoughts?
Sure. Well, thank you for that helpful paper. I'm going to be talking about the changes between DSM-4 and 5 as it relates to dementia. The simple answer to the question is what the change is that the psychiatrists are proposing to change the word to cure dementia, eradicate it, and replace it with Major Neurocognitive Disorder. I think that this is occurring in a context where, if I can go back to Alan Francis, who actually severely criticized the DSM-5 process and proposed that this might actually have psychiatrists lose control over the process, because this notion of the psychiatrist making the Swiss Army knife may actually not be the right group of people. For example, the American Psychological Association has been up in arms about some aspects of DSM-5. So what I would say Alan Francis might say, using the baseball metaphor, is not who's calling the balls and strikes, but who's deciding who are going to be the umpires. I actually did my homework seriously and went all the way back to DSM-1, because the history of the DSMs can tell you the history of the field. Back in DSM-1 and 2, we were talking about organic brain syndromes, which was a time where the dominant motif was kind of psychoanalytic. And as biological psychiatry came into the ascendancy, you saw more and more different terms, including then in DSM-4, dementia of the Alzheimer type, combining these two words together. So the DSM-5, as I said, creates the structure Major Neurocognitive Disorder and Minor Neurocognitive Disorder. And I suspect DSM-5R will be very minor neurocognitive disorder. And I'll explain my comment there. Now, how do we get that term? Well, in part from the composition of the committee, because we look at the tool makers, right? So the committee is led by Dilip Jesti, who is one of the world's most wonderful psychiatrists and a friend of mine, who actually rose to the ascendancy of being the president of the American Psychiatric Association elect. So he's kind of excused himself from the space of chairing that committee. And now David Kupfer, whose name is associated with many of the DSMs going back at least, I think, to perhaps 3 or certainly 4, is now the chair, or the person that Dilip asked me to talk to. Now, the paper on the website is dated from 2010. And remember, we've got to remember, DSM-5 is supposed to come out in sometime early 2013. So we're talking about an incomplete process here. But Dilip is a colleague of Igor Grant, who used that term Major Neurocognitive Disorder in the AIDS community initially. There's a lot with AIDS where the primary principal problem is not dementia, but can be. There was a need to destigmatize saying to people with AIDS that you have a dementia, so he proposed this alternative term, which he's now introducing into the dementia space itself. David Kupfer, in an email on Friday, said he is confident that these major and minor designations will appear in DSM-5. So hold on to your hat and pay some attention to them, because we're not clear all these things are going to show up in the final form. Another member of the committee is Ron Peterson, who is a neurologist. Occasionally the psychiatrists allow us a little voice. And he is the one who promoted the term mild cognitive impairment. So there now mild cognitive impairment is supposed to be before dementia. It's when you don't have significant impairments in activities of daily living. So that is where the minor neurocognitive impairment appeared for. So why did they come up with these different terms? Well, partly they're trying to address the destigmatization process, maybe to call somebody, you can say to your boss, my boss was acting demented today in an English way, in fashion. You probably don't want to go around saying my boss was demonstrating, features of major neurocognitive disorder. Nobody would know what you're talking about. But to destigmatize it. In fact, interestingly, in Japan, they've had a public health campaign to change the word dementia, which is in Japanese is chiho, which means a disease of cognition associated with idiocy. I see a translator is helping me out. And then ninshisho, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, is the new term, which means cognitive condition, cognitive syndrome. So we're kind of studying whether the destigmatization in Japanese of the word dementia is actually an effective social intervention. Now, I mentioned, I'm just now criticizing the term a little bit, but I'll tell you about what I think the purpose is. Now, the word neurocognitive, to me, is a strange one. It's almost as strange as organic brain syndrome. When I heard that one as a medical student, I said, well, are there inorganic brain syndromes? Well, of course, there were supposed to be some that weren't as brainy as, but so neurocognitive, I mean, why do you need the word neuro? You could call it major cognitive disorder, right? Well, I think the word neuro has a lot of saliency these days. We were talking about that at lunch. There's neurophilosophy, neuroethics, neurotheology, and so now to bring the word neuro, this is the world of biological psychiatry. We've got to have neuro in there. We've got neurocognitive. The problem with this is not so much those labels, which I don't think are terribly effective at affecting stigma, and I think we've written an article to criticize it. By the way, that article is entitled "The Evolving Classification of Dementia, Placing the DSM-V in a Meaningful History and Cultural Context and Pondering the Future of Alzheimer's." I think that was the first page of the article. That was in the co-authored with somebody I wanted to mention, Danny George, who's a colleague who writes with me, including the Myth of Alzheimer's book. So we have been challenging this notion that this transition represents helpful change. But let's focus for a minute on that last clause, pondering the future of Alzheimer's disease, because as Barbara said, I wrote a book, Danny wrote a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's. What does that mean? Let me tell you my arguments, just to tell you what the experts are doing in the field. We have now constructed a new class of Alzheimer's, which is asymptomatic Alzheimer's, or preclinical. Those are the guidelines from the NIA and the Alzheimer's Association. And of course, since you're not supposed to show any symptoms to have that diagnosis, it has to be defined by biomarkers. So this is an effort to diagnose forms of Alzheimer's disease earlier and earlier by even we can get rid of the psychiatrists in DSM pretty soon. We'll just all go in and get our biomarkers and be diagnosed in that process. However, at the same time that the first set of guidelines introduced the notion of asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease, the new neuropathology guidelines say that the neuropathology is disengaged from the clinical features. Now, for those of you that know this field at all, you know we've been walking around saying the only way to make a definite diagnosis of Alzheimer's is to look at a piece of brain tissue. Well, the truth is out that you can't do that because there are lots of people, perhaps 30%, who run around with plaques and tangles in their brain functioning perfectly well. So the root validating process, which is the ultimate autopsy, is no longer valid. So our other criticism of these DSM-V guidelines is they leave Alzheimer's disease and they leave mild cognitive impairment essentially untouched. So they don't get at what I think are some of the hearts of the issues around the nosology in this category. I will also point to a new book that's emerging from Margaret Locke, the famous Canadian anthropologist from McGill, now retired, who calls her book The Alzheimer's Conundrum, Entanglements of Dementia and Aging, essentially making many of the same points that I've made. I was making a joke with somebody that, well, I better not go there because it'll be insulting to psychiatrists, but the psychiatrists are getting increasingly confused. We can put a label on the psychiatrists themselves as to what kind of psychiatric condition they're suffering from with regards to this confusion about terminology, which is increasingly coming into the fore, but not in DSM-V itself. So I think to address the other question about the ethics and the differences I've identified, and our first speaker, Serife, identified things like conflict of interest. And by the way, I don't think bioethicists do a good job of challenging medicine the way they should. To my knowledge, there's only one investigative bioethicist in the world, and that's Carl Elliott, who writes lots of books on this topic. If you looked at these multiple roles you were describing and the sources of income supporting those different roles, you would see a lot about the effects on DSM-5 of these various conflicts. And I think the other big problem is that the privileging of this kind of biological model, the quest for the cure, the search for these biomarkers and the treatments linked to them, is doing a huge disservice to our society, because I think if we were to invest more in public education, invest more in prevention, teaching kids healthy foods to eat, to exercise, how to keep their brains active, we could mount a massive and effective campaign that would benefit our society enormously and go a long way to preventing, at least to a degree, some of the late life cognitive impairment we have. For example, I once asked Paul Volpe, the neuroethicist, is the fact that we are still poisoning kids in Cleveland, in China, and elsewhere with lead an issue for neuroethicists? And he said, I don't know, we didn't define it that way. We're just, interested in MRI scans and all this kind of stuff. Well, I think the gaze of bioethics is an ethical question here. If bioethicists don't pay attention to these broader issues of the domination of the medical model on trying to help us stay healthy, and not say there are things we could be doing in society, particularly in a society increasingly challenged ecologically by global climate change, then bioethics is not doing its job. And I would just end by saying that the person who taught me about bioethics is the man who invented the word, Van Rensselaer-Potter, whose ethics was inspired by a land ethic. So this may be very, very far away from major neurocognitive disorders, because it's not. Because if we want to address the social challenge of dementia or major neurocognitive disorders, we have to move beyond a purely medical fix-it model. And bioethicists, in my opinion, need to return to those environmental roots and take up this challenge of medicine and some of the silliness that's evident in DSM-5.
Peter, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Julie, your 10 minutes. And thanks for keeping to the time, too.
Close.
I will be focusing on neurodevelopmental disorders, and I do have a knife analogy. Well, not quite a knife, but a cleaver analogy. So just a background of the tradition that I'm coming from and how I view the person, the sufferer, the individual who's experiencing the mental disorder or disease, if you will. And I'd like to cite Ian Hacking and quote him from Rewriting the Soul, as he says, "The working clinician is seldom a total empiric. Disease and disorder are identified according to the underlying vision of health and humanity, of what kinds of beings we are and what can go wrong with us. The subject under psychiatric investigation," and this is me quoting myself, "is not just a biological organism or a psychosocial being, nor is it an additive lamination of the two. In an embodied person, the biological body and the cognitive mind are interactive, unified, and whole. When a subject is mentally diseased or has a disorder, an abnormality or a malfunction affects the person as a whole, and not merely the body or the mind. Moreover, it is important as we start asking these ethical questions to understand what it is, what it's like from the inside to be the person with a mental disease or disorder. And these links, the metaphysical, the epistemological, and the ethical, need to go hand in hand. We need to keep these links in mind, especially when we start looking at the neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'm going to focus primarily on the autistic spectrum disorder. Autistic spectrum disorder, or ASD, is the DSM-5's proposed new category, combining subtypes, including autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, while eliminating Rett's disorder, despite the fact that young girls are experiencing autistic-like symptoms, but because there's a mutated gene, it has been eliminated from the category. Each of the aforementioned disorders was independent of the label of autism in the DSM-4, categorized under pervasive developmental disorder. That has been eliminated. In addition, new categories have emerged: social communication disorder, learning disorder, which has changed to specific learning disorder, eliminating dyslexia, dyscalculia, and disorder of written expression. they're no longer being recommended. So writers of the DSM-5 said that the DSM-4 criteria for autism were equivalent to cleaving meatloaf at its joints, and thus a single disorder with a spectrum of impairments or deficits is warranted. While the description of autism and related subtypes makes sense to be on a continuum for my person-centered view, some persons are not going to fit into this particular category within the domains, within the criteria outlined by the proposed changes. It is estimated with several field trials that 30 to 40% of persons who are currently diagnosed with autism, Asperger's, or PDD-NOS will not fit into the category. One of the most controversial issues surrounding the revisions include this new category, social communication disorder. It's a subset of neurodevelopmental disorders where ASD is also housed and listed with communication disorders, including speech and language disorders. But it has been described as a classification to characterize children who have a primary difficulty with the pragmatic aspects of social communication, both comprehension and formulation, and with discourse comprehension. Conceivably, those who may not be diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder will be placed into this particular category. But several questions arise. What is to be gained by creating this new diagnosis that looks, for all intents and purposes, as ASD? There's only 4 studies that have actually been listed, starting in 1983. And as I just recently, yesterday, went on the website looking at the severity of social communication disorder, this is what I read. Recommendations for severity criteria for this disorder are forthcoming. What is the true rationale behind this construction? Is it to satisfy the public and those who may not be labeled as autistic? To have a diagnosis to convince the healthcare systems of the world that services are needed for those who do not make the cut? So I propose both ethical benefits and burdens to the changes, proposed changes for autistic spectrum disorder and related changes and developments with this social communication disorder. One, the continuum of ASD does force us to think about the nuances among persons, that perhaps this continuum of ASD does not make us have to cleave the meatloaf, so to speak. There is a need to reorganize subdomains for increasing clarity and specificity across different age ranges and language levels. And there has been proposed, at least, runaway diagnostic inflation. As SKUs in 2012, just a recent article says, this needs to be nipped in the bud, where false positives will be reduced. And of healthcare professionals, use the DSM quite as a guide and if they do not act as a total empiric, and focus on the individual person, the domains and criterion of the DSM will not be as restrictive, leaving more room for interpretation, balanced by more consistent diagnoses and treatment recommendations. However, I have several ethical burdens to share. Numerous persons who would otherwise be diagnosed in the DSM-4 TR would not fit into one of these categories, particularly autistic spectrum disorder, and may not receive the necessary health care and services that are needed. And Colonel Ritchie, one of our plenary speakers, echoed this with regard to PTSD. This is an issue of justice, and unfortunately a system of health and billing that focuses on labels may not recognize the individual needs of persons who do not possess a label may not actually get those services. Without specific subtypes and descriptions of some disorders, such as dyslexia, beneficial treatments and services specific to that type of deficit or delay may not be provided. There's also a lack of evidence. Types and subtypes were created with few field trials. Conflicting research is emerging. Parents may falsely report behaviors of their children so as to receive the necessary label or diagnostic services and health care. And there's very much resistance to the medical community as it is. The Wakefield studies, the media hype regarding vaccinations or to use, not to use, the Marisol and so forth. Parents are very much resistant to working with clinicians. And the concept of the embodied person is still not at the center of the DSM, when domains and criterion are restrictive and unable to account for those nuances, particularly if we look at gender, minority, ethnicity, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So thank you all three for your comments. I'm wondering, from what you heard from each other, is there anything you'd want to ask one another before I open it up for everybody else? Do you want to kind of push or challenge each other on?
I'm interested in this grieving, the idea that you can put a time limit on grief. And again, it kind of balances with what I was saying about not recognizing the embodied person, the social nuances, the cultural nuances, where grief takes many different forms, just as pain does. And I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and grief issue received a lot of different criticisms, and the common, one of the common things that have been identified is, are we medicalizing a normal response to a loss, basically? And Arthur Kleinman actually has a really good article. Arthur Kleinman is a medical anthropologist, and he worked on psychiatry and illness narratives and on various topics. And in this beautiful article, he talks about his own grief experience after losing his life partner of 25 years. And he talks about how it is challenging for him to accept that, his response to the loss of his loved one actually can be medicalized as grief. And in the same article, he addresses cultural differences. And I can attest to that. My background is Turkish, and in Eastern cultures, for instance, widows are expected to mourn for their entire lives. That's part of the cultural practice. And now, you might take that individual who is continuing their grief and bring it to a Western culture and diagnose with, this condition. But I also see the point that is being made, which is, well, this person is having difficulty, and for us to be able to provide any kind of support, we need the name and the label. And there again, we have this conflict because we don't have perhaps normal venues in our present health system to be supportive to those individuals who are grieving, that we have to medicalize it in one way so that we can actually get them into treatment or get them some kind of help. So it's a double-edged sword. And
that comment of this person is experiencing this, rather than what is it like to ask that person, what is it like to go through the grieving process?
Yeah,
we don't often ask that question.
I like the word that they use to differentiate complicated grief.
Yeah.
Now, that means you can have simple grief, but complicated is a funny word. It's cultural issues. It's if you lead a complicated life, you probably have complicated grief. It's also these words we pick, they're picking disorder, major neurocognitive disorder. We talked a bit in some other sessions about, you call it illness, do you call it a disease, do you call it a disability? Mm-hmm. Now we're calling things disordered. Mm-hmm. So this notion that, and I agree with you, that somebody invented this notion of instrumental validity. I think if we knew, and that's the problem with the statistical manual, there's not enough empirical data to support a lot of the recommendations. If we knew that putting somebody on Prozac actually did help, and there were some thresholds, or giving them CBT or whatever, if we had any evidence that there were things we could do, that's the instrumental validity. Does this classification lead to differences that affect individual people where they have a voice in that whole process as well? Because I certainly strongly agree with you.
Yeah. And I have a question to perhaps Peter. Do you think that, from your experience with patients, do patients respond to being called, neurocognitive disorder versus forgetful? What do patients want?
Well, I think it goes back to that very interesting and very important principle to have on the table. When people introduced mild cognitive impairment into the space, Ron Peterson popularizing it, there were some people that did studies of what that label meant to people, and it was very, very variable, because to some people, and it depends on which doctor labels you, literally, mild cognitive impairment means, I don't have Alzheimer's. The other is, wait a minute, that's early Alzheimer's, it's just a matter of time. I think in general, we invent labels without enough attention to the input from people that are potentially affected by them, which is why I think Alan Francis's point that the psychiatrists need to relinquish some control, not only to psychologists, social workers,
right.
but, you know, diseases are not discovered by doctors or scientists. They are invented at the interface between science and society. So let's get society's voice in this process.
And working with parents of autistic children, and it's interesting because what I'm seeing, I mean, they're keeping up on this. I mean, they're very interested in these changes, and I'm already seeing some severed relationships where the mother of the child with Asperger's is saying, well, my child has Asperger's. I don't want my child to have autism. I don't want this ASD. That means my child's going to be lumped into, you know, with all the other autistic kids. And so the feeling that my child is abled as opposed to disabled has been severing the community.
I'm really sorry we would get rid of Asperger's, because people with Asperger's have invented a name for the rest of us, neurotypicals. So if you eliminate Asperger's, I mean, the point being that disability, particularly, like the deaf community, you know, you can be deaf and be abled, and you can be, or you can be a, gotta be careful here, a relatively independent person with a label of autism, namely Asperger's. They actually think they have intellectual attributes that are above and beyond us. They're the computer geeks that think they can understand how things connect better than normal human beings, quote unquote normal.
So thank you for talking. I'm really pleased with that, so thank you. Can I open it up for everybody else to talk about? Obviously the DSM-V is huge, and we've heard about 3 kind of disorders. So Grant, do you want to get us started, please?
I think I first met you, Julie, at an intensive master's course.
Can I just ask?
Yes, you taught me.
I did.
Yes, you did.
Oh.
In fact, you inspired me to go into this field.
Well, now the interesting thing is not just that reminiscence, but on that course, one of the students had done the course because he had 3 children who between them had 8 different psychiatric diagnoses.
Oh, wow.
So we spent 2 3-day weekends intensely looking at the model of the embodied, situated brain as the basis of the mind, the psyche. At the end of it, the conclusion that emerges, of course, is that, as in a sense, Julia Christavis' conclusion, that any therapist who does not discover a new disorder in every patient is failing to take a proper history. Because everybody's different. But the interesting thing is this guy, whose 3 kids had 8 diagnoses, came up with, having told me how concerned he was about more, and that's why he'd done the course on the mind and mental function, mental disorder, came up and said to me, you know, I was doing a lot of thinking over last night, and I wonder if there's anything wrong with any of my children at all.
Wow.
Now, isn't that interesting?
It is interesting, and you know, parents have come to me asking that, and I mentioned a little bit about resistance to the medical community, and so they're finding other ways to do self-treatment or to do alternative treatments that could be harmful, like chelation therapy. And so
the danger is that these people are going to be cut off from an experienced voice dealing with the kind of disconnections or mismatches that cause all kinds of social pathology and micro sociological settings.
Because if I can just go back to that previous slide with the umpires from Alan. So this, I mean, the third umpire, he wants to characterize as the anti-psychiatry movement, ZAWS, etc., is that it's all socially constructed. So it's trying to, I mean, one is that there is, you know, biological, it's out there. There are real conditions, and maybe we have difficulty finding them, etc., because the brain is so complex, etc. But they actually exist. that there's some kind of truth to them, validity. Then the second one is certainly more about, it's about coming up with different consensus around diagnosis, and we have expert opinions, and it works, or there's some pragmatics, and that's important, but it's not really good. So he kind of nicely frames these three kind of angles to look at. And so I think with the person you were talking about, Graham, it's kind of like, well, maybe they're all just fine, and sort of like kind of resonates with, or, and their context makes it difficult.
There is psychiatric, and it's good that experienced people help people deal with it. The point is rather that our taxonomies ought not to be treated with reverence, but in fact with a healthy skepticism as aids to good clinical care, rather than as prescriptions for what kind of clinical care ought to be delivered.
So Peter, and I see your...
I think there are very broad issues. There is suffering in the world, and there always will be. You don't have to be a Buddhist to believe that. But the question is, how can you label some kinds of suffering that seems to fit in the province of a certain kind of individual that identifies themselves as a healer in society? The other thing, though, I think, is the human race is both blessed and cursed by the fact that we label things in the world. The issue of labeling is not just an issue for medicine, but if you label some things incorrectly, as we have done through our days, or at least contextualize, the context has changed, so the word needs to change, then to me, the constant exploration of what words are we using and who has the power and what are the conflicting roles that those people in power have, to build on your point, is really important, to keep asking that question, because the words are going to change. I mean, I often point to homosexuality. I mean, Lord knows that it was out of DSM-3, I think, and I think the APA officially declared it not a disease in 1973. But just talk about a social, let's call it social phenomena that has been medicalized and then demedicalized.
Yeah, and if you look at even personality disorders from the time of the DSM-3 to now, now dissociation disorder, it used to be the presence of multiple personalities. Now it's proposed that it should be characterized by feelings of these multiple personalities. So the language is changing, evolving, where the identity of what is it is changing, but yet the sufferer still is in the background.
Yeah, related to this, I kind of want to raise a question. One of the earlier criticisms that the DSM-5 task force received was that everything was happening behind closed doors. So neither the public nor other interest groups like patients and their families were involved in the decision-making process. It was a result of those criticisms that the DSM-5 task force actually published preliminary proposals for the changes. And I've been thinking about this seriously, and there are some philosophers and ethicists like John Sadler and Bill Fulford put forward this idea of including patients and their families into the decision-making process. So in the language of what constitutes an illness in psychiatric taxonomy, patients or their families should have a right to. And I kind of want to get a feel for clinicians and philosophers in the room for is this a good idea? Should we be pushing for this? Should it be more egalitarian and democratic rather than a group of individuals deciding for patients and other interests?
No, you're asking that as a rhetorical question?
I mean, yeah, I just...
I feel like we're holding psychiatry to a completely different standard that every other medical specialty is held to. Nobody asked the appendectomy patient what they think of. I mean, I recognize the reasons for doing that, but I kind of think that there are things about, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've looked at the DSM-4, and there are things that I think, this is really inconsistent, this doesn't make sense, because we consider the language of mental illness to be our language, to be a common language that civilians, that non-clinicians have just as much access to. I don't know, I mean, I think that kind of threat, you can say that that's a problem with DSM-4. To me, that's a problem with the cultural situation of psychiatry and whether or not we recognize that there is clinical expertise in talking about categories in the first place. I mean, it's very, frankly, I think that Chris Dava saying that anyone who doesn't discover a new disorder with every patient is failing is like, well, okay, well then how are you going to train psychiatrists? Chris Dava, I think, being herself, would say we're going to train them in literary criticism. We're going to train them in close analysis of individual texts by great poets. But in order to train clinicians, people who are treating large populations, you need archetypes. And I think that just criticizing the idea of an archetype is wrong to apply only to psychiatry.
Who'd like to take that on? Thank you.
Well, as a neurologist trained in psychiatry, the issues of diagnosis are absolutely not unique to psychiatry. Neurology has made lots of mistakes as well. And in fact, dementia exists at the boundaries between neurologists and psychiatrists. Part of the history of the DSMs is that psychiatrists have not wanted to be thrown out of medicine. Literally, I was at a Department of Psychiatry meeting at Hopkins where they really felt they were going to, tell the psychiatrists to leave the medical school. So for the last 25 years, the psychiatrists have been grasping at having a place in medicine, and they think that DSM-V, which will make them more like other doctors, is part of that process. There's a pharmaceutical pressure here too, because it's a lot easier to diagnose somebody as having a disease based on a biological marker where you don't even have to talk to the patient. And so this notion that if we can just biologize psychiatry enough that we've got markers that we can treat. So I do think there are things unique to psychiatry. Part of it has been their history in the field of medicine. Part of the fact is that I love psychiatry because it sound like I don't like psychiatrists, but I love psychiatry. No, just kidding. I know you don't. I'm jesting. They have got some of the most complicated conditions in the field of human suffering, where they're constantly at the boundary between what is the province of medicine and not the province of medicine. So, more power to them. But they have gotten a little crazy, a little silly, as I said, as they've tried to defend their position within the medical establishment.
Julie or Serife,
Sorry.
do you want to respond to the question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the phenomenon of mental disorder is really, really complex. And, psychiatry is in this really, I think, vulnerable place where it's trying to be a scientific discipline, but it's also a discipline that, the aim of which is care. So it's also a branch of a medical discipline. And, when you look at kind of more basic sciences like physics, chemistry, where it's easier to identify the territories of your scientific target, like the chemical. Think about chemical elements or gold, right? That gold's atomic number is the same and it's not going to change, and the territory is marked. But how do we mark the territory of mental disorder? Because it's intrinsically a normative concept. Like if I start screaming right now in the middle of the room and start breaking the windows, etc., I will be deviating from the norm. But if I do this, if I display the same behavior in a group of individuals who are doing all the same thing, I wouldn't be marked as disordered. So it's intrinsically a normative concept, and it's not easy to identify boundaries. But and I want to actually emphasize that I'm not critical of psychiatry in the sense that I want to abandon it and get rid of it altogether. But I think what psychiatry needs is a kind of multitude of interest groups has to come together. It has to be a synthesis. We need people who are doing molecular research on genetics and neuroscience of mental disorder, but we also need social workers and nurses who will be hands-on helping patients and bringing what they learn from the patients to psychiatric research. So we need basically a marriage of all various scientific and humanistic disciplines to, deal with this complexity, which is the mental disorder.
Julie?
Even though this doesn't directly answer your question, at least looking at philosophical traditions of conceptualizing health and disease, we've struggled. We continue to struggle. I mean, we're moving away from the Christopher Bors's concepts of health and disease. He too struggled with conceiving what a mental illness is. And quite frankly, if we look at health and disease holistically, mental and physical health more holistically, we can come to both the normative and descriptive aspects of that. However, practically, pragmatically, you go to many states in this country, you go to different countries, what happens with funding? You have your mental health pot of money and you have the rest of healthcare. And we become this ancillary arm, if you will, and we're treated from a mental health standpoint that you are different and fuzzy and these boundaries are not discrete.
So the lady in the blue shawl and then Chuck, come to you. I forgot.
So, in listening to the panel, but also listening to some of my colleagues who do research in DSM. So, for Lisa Cosgrove is one who's been doing some very specific work in conflicts of interest in the DSM panel. And then listening to the panel here, and as a social work trained psychotherapist myself, I have two reflections. And first, what good is the DSM at all anymore? All I hear are negatives and criticisms. And the second thing I come across with is that as a social work trained in psychotherapy, we take, or at least my brand being trained in Columbia, was that we took the DSM as a grain of salt. It was one tool among many that we use to diagnose and to seek treatments for our clients. We don't even often call them patients, or people we're trying to help. And coming at it from the complicated grief was one of the areas where I specialized in. And although it's true that the term is very problematic if you sort of analyze the text as the woman over here sort of describes, but on the other hand, there's something to it. With looking at least in an American culture in New York City where I was practicing, there was something to it. And sort of taking that perspective and then looking at social workers do, or as our climate as an anthropologist does, looking at the context and taking treatment beyond just the pharmacological, but to the family, to the community. So I guess my comment is mixed up with what are the benefits do you see in taking the DSM and the new iterations of it, and how do we take it from here? Moving in a positive direction.
Do you want to start? Sure. In fact, your second question comment kind of answered your first. As a guide, it can be beneficial, and I know the writers of the DSM caution healthcare providers to use it as a cookbook of, here's your criteria and you need to fit in this criteria. The dangers are when we do try to force people into those particular criteria. But as a guide, it can be beneficial. There's some common language nationally, internationally, that we can agree at least upon that there's features that are very similar. But again, the dangers are making sure that everyone fits perfectly into those features. So as a guide, it can be beneficial.
Peter?
I think I'm a little bit with Alan Francis. I think that to the extent that the process that DSM-5 encourages social conversation about the challenges, and it is an open process, and that will be valuable. I would go back to what I said before, which is in general in medicine, the reason to diagnose is that there is this presumption that a more precise diagnosis leads to a more precise therapy. If I walk in the room and see somebody with little memory problems, I can call that a mild cognitive impairment. Or if you're talking to a client and their grief is obviously complex because of whatever, it does help provide some kind of architecture. Somebody's word that somebody used earlier. The trouble in my field that I'm talking about, dementia and Alzheimer's, is that there is this sense that the further specificity of the diagnosis is going to lead to specific biological interventions. In our field, brain health is emerging as a general comment, a concept. And that's something that really helps you with your brain regardless of what the condition is. It's a very non-specific therapy, but it includes things like having gardens in public schools and encouraging communities to embrace members of the community. It gets to that disability word. Disability is something that can be referred to the individual, but also the community in which that individual exists. So the great danger, I think, is that to the extent that the DSM-5 doesn't engender richer conversation, but really promotes the agenda of restricted social responses to huge complex problems, it's going to be an impediment to improving the health of people.
Yeah, I think your question raises a really important point, which is, okay, so we knew that this was an operational manual and it was just meant to guide us. How did it get also out of control and became, you know, part of our culture, basically? I call this phenomenon the DSM culture because it has so many applications in different contexts. What, you know, from the place that a description of a mental disorder in the manual all the way to the patient, there are these multiple venues, and it's almost kind of evolves as it's being disseminated. So, you know, with the dissemination of this, you know, symptomatic language of describing mental disorder, we have all these emerging so-called cures that will treat those symptoms, and, you know, we have this kind of buzzy and somehow helpful yet somehow harmful language of the DSM culture. And I worry about patients in particular because, you know, imagine that you are psychologically vulnerable, say you experience hallucinations, and so everything in your, like in the way that you experience yourself seems fuzzy and all over the place. And at that time, actually having a description, a solid description of your state, that label might be really helpful because, you know, it gives you that kind of certainty in the face of uncertainty that you face with. But then what happens after you just absorb that label to your like identity? And at that point, it might start to have more constraining impact on how you perceive yourself and the actions that you want to kind of proceed. So if you, for instance, take the stigma associated, for instance, with schizophrenia, that you will be unable to work, I mean, you might, as an individual, really constrain yourself by thinking that, well, I will also be, you know, I will fulfill that schizophrenia stereotype, so I'm not going to be able to work. And how you perceive yourself is really important when you're acting as an agent in the world. So in that sense, I think these diagnostic categories are double-edged swords, and you really want to be careful in training, I mean, in teaching the patients about their illness, to be careful that this, you know, to make it clear to them that this is just an operational tool. You don't have to fulfill all the criteria. Like whatever happened to that other schizophrenic patient at that time does not necessarily have to happen to you, because these are complex and each individual is different and experiences mental disorder in a different way. So I think more regimentation into how the DSM manuals are used and taken up by the society is like the necessary step. You know, if we can't, you know, create a Swiss Army knife yet, like, so we want to be more regimented about how we use it.
Chuck, your question.
I think one of the things I'm worried about is I think you just touched on that, is that it becomes the Delphi that you go to, and now the insurance companies, the state medical societies are all making judgments of, well, autism is a psychiatric disease, so we can't fund them through Medicaid, fund them through behavior health. In Delaware, we cannot get after-school care for kids with retardation and autism because it's a psychiatric disease and not funded. So we're making societal decisions based on information that really is not appropriate.
Yeah, and following Wittgenstein and, you know, the language games, we are creating these games and expecting people to know how to play the games. You know, I throw a ball at you, you catch it, but I throw a ball at, you know, Grant and he doesn't. You know, there's this difference of, we don't always understand the same type of game, and the insurance companies, they're beginning to see, oh, here we're working with this DSM, we're playing the same game, but parents, healthcare professionals, they're stuck out. They're going, we don't understand this particular game. Or when we do, we're going to start fabricating our stories. We're going to start making sure that when we do report that our 2-year-old has repetitive behaviors, we're going to exacerbate those symptoms. And so that emergence of falsification and just the depletion of the reality behind the person who's suffering is emerging.
Can I just interject? Because doing a lot of reading, so I'm just going to try and capture what Alan Francis was talking about. because I think this kind of fuels what you're pointing to. Because he says the DSM-4 and the 5s, it's really they're doing too many things. So what he wants to argue is that what needs to happen is we just need to hang on to the research. So until the research provides some evidence that of just what is the case for a mental health problem, you don't change the DSM. So you wait to have the driver be in the research. And it may be that there are people, he wants to argue, that are suffering because they're waiting for a diagnosis, or they're waiting for a new category, for example. He says, but that's not what the DSM should be for. It should be about trying to get clearer on the biology, etc.
Well, yeah.
And then politically, and so you can't, if clinicians are fiddling things to try and get some services for a particular person they're looking after, he says that can't be the DSM-5. We have to educate our clinicians, or they have to become much more political in what they're doing. But one of the arguments he makes is that there's too much, that the DSM-5, or the DSMs I should say, cannot do all these things. And so we have to kind of like your Swiss Army knife. So I just wanted to say that's what your reaction is, that he wants to go, he wants to say it's too soon to change. There's not enough research to get clear on what are the symptoms, et cetera, for reliability or validity. So we need more research. So he would want to argue we should not be, in general, changing it. So I just want to throw that out on his behalf.
The problem with that, from my perspective, is the biggest circle in somebody's diagram was the researchers. I mean, they're the clear people that benefit from all this machination. And in fact, have you ever read a scientific paper that didn't end with more research is needed? I think the problem with Alan's perspective is that all the answers to the challenges, the imbroglio of the DSM process is not going to be answered by empirical research. So I think at some point we're talking about cultural values around the role of health care in culture and the role of people in their own lives. So I think the danger of that kind of attitude is it just says, okay, if you agree to this, give us lots more money and we will come back 10 years from now with a new DSM-5R or whatever. And perhaps the only benefit is that there have been a lot of psychiatrists that have had a lot of nice meetings and a lot of nice hotels. I'm being a little bit excessively critical, but I really do think that this more research is needed is a mantra that needs to be challenged a bit.
We could go back to just calling everything neurasthenia.
I think, there is a danger. I think you guys have done a better job than I have of finding the critical balance. As I said, we couldn't exist in the world if we didn't name things. Mm-hmm. But every time we name things, we need to really ask the question, who is asking us to name it that? What is the value for people? And if the circumstances change, does that name work for us or not?
Yes.
So as a child psychiatrist,
Could you just speak up a little bit louder for the people at the back?
as a child psychiatrist, I want to respond to your comment about the research, and I'm a clinical researcher. So the problems didn't just start with DSM-5. We started to have these problems actually with, I go back to the previous millennium. We started to have these problems with DSM-3. And in particular in child psychiatry, but I think the same applies to adult psychiatry, the diagnostic categories are not necessarily always valid, which means that the groups on whom the research are being done are a little bit problematic. So that in one center, a group of kids might be called bipolar disorder. In another center, very similar kids might be called depression plus anxiety. And in another center, they might be called ADHD. This is because of the problem with the diagnostic criteria of DSM. So on the one hand, I absolutely agree with you, we need more research, but we really need reliable and valid diagnostic criteria that are applied in the same way in different institutions by different researchers so that we are all talking about the same groups of people. And the same problems occur in adult psychiatry. So a term, for example, that, lots of research, for example, in adult psychiatry on bipolar disorder, again, who are these different bipolar patients? Are all centers calling these same patients the same things? And so, I think we've got some major, major problems, and we're just perpetuating them. The DSM-5 is the max of the making it bad.
Responses to your comments. Thank you.
One measure of progress, since you're talking historically, is in DSM-1, there are 106 labels, in DSM-2, 182, in DSM-3, 263, DSM-4, about 374 in the first version. So, it's just it's one statement.
Wow.
Sharife?
Yeah.
It's just evidence of the lack of knowledge. I mean, we're in trouble, and we need to be able to say we're in trouble.
Yeah, I think you raised a really great point, and one of the concerns for the DSM-5, for instance, is that, it's so early to validify these categories that they're coming up with, and that, there haven't been enough clinical trials that test for reliability and validity across different contexts, so all of these new categories or revised categories won't have any reliability or diagnostic validity. And also it reminded me of a true story basically happened in Argentina. So in Argentina, the official language of the official diagnostic criteria is still psychoanalytic. They rely on psychodynamic approaches. And a French biotechnology company wants to do research on bipolar disorder, and they need patients diagnosed with bipolar disorder to include in their research. And they can't find enough patients in France, so they come to Argentina to a mental health hospital. And overnight, the mental health hospital switches to the DSM framework as opposed to the psychoanalytic framework. Overnight, patients who were once diagnosed with psychosis in psychoanalysis are now turned to bipolar disorder, and they start doing research. I mean, this is actually very important. Like, this is in a way, funny story, like anecdote, yet another, evidence that, there are different ways in which psychiatric research are misguided. But this is not a joke. Overnight, you change the life, the diagnosis and the life of all of those patients, and, subject them to clinical research. And these are extremely important points, and I think we need to have more conversation and raise these challenges against people who are making these decisions.
Julia Peters?
When I was looking at the criteria for specific learning disorder, there's a long list, and one of them is spelling mistakes. I'm thinking, you just need the one criteria, and I'm thinking, wow, half of my medical students would be under this particular disorder. I think we're starting just to see this emergence of criteria that possibly all of us could fit in at some point or another. And so I question, what is mental health?
Mm-hmm. Can I just take one step further what you said, and with the example of ASD versus social communication disorder? So clearly, there are researchers who are interested in social communication disorder. So a bunch of kids who are in these other categories are soon going to be social communication disorder kids, and that's going to become the diagnosis du jour. Mm-hmm. I mean, so we have a problem, except these are holy cows, and we can't say anything about them.
About 36% of adults may end up even in that category.
And we probably haven't mentioned money enough, because DSM-5 is not officially tied to reimbursement, but there are indirect connections there. And the point that was made by our speaker about PTSD, as a neurologist, I rarely see people who have, I don't do disability work, but I believe that Alzheimer's affects quality of life of people in part because they get the label Alzheimer's, as you were saying. And some of these labels people adopt them in part because it's tied to getting services. So the impact of the DSM-5 is going to be intimately related to healthcare reform and what people are willing to pay whom for which services.
Thank you, Peter. Yes.
My question was in relation to the diagnosis or classification of somatoform disorders, and I don't know if it falls within your specialty, but it has come up in the conference a number of times, and just an example of how difficult it is to name something we have very insufficient knowledge about. And so DSM-4 labels the somatoform disorders as somatization, conversion disorder, undifferentiated somatoform disorder, and body dysmorphic disorder, and hypothyroidism. And so DSM-5 makes a couple suggestions, and I don't really know what the ultimate decision will be, but just again, thoughts on, well, how do we really label something we have so insufficient knowledge about, and should be, what should be the role of patients and patient advocates in helping to come to kind of a decision, and how does this influence potential research of these disorders?
Can I sort of, if I put my Alan Francis hat on, because that's who I've been reading, so I'll do the best, and I apologize to him if I get it wrong, but I think what he might say, kind of a little bit of a new point than what we've heard from the panelists, what he wants to argue, what he's seeing with the DSM-5, is that too much seems to be coming down from the APA, the top down, and the work groups. Like that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling kind of modus operandi, rather than what he would want to argue, there needs to be more from clinicians. What he wants to say from the ground up, where you are all struggling, for example, and you're seeing, these labels and these categories don't apply, and so a particular diagnosis needs to be really worked on. But he's kind of he worries that it's too much, that once it was committed that DSM-5 was going to be coming out, then it's okay, we're going to now work on it. It gets to be this top down. So I just want to throw that out about what do we make sense of these different diagnoses. I think he'd say, perhaps, go back to the clinicians and hear what they're seeing and what they're encountering to figure out how big is the problem and where is the problem. So I'll just offer that on his behalf. Julie or Peter or Serife, do you want to respond?
I don't know anything about somatoform disorders in DSM-5, but to the extent that I understand them and that labeling, it gets us back to neurasthenia. It gets to the fact that the somatoform disorders, hysteria too, it's remarkable in the space between neurology and psychiatry where we both play, because as a neurologist I may claim to know more about how paralysis occurs in the nervous system. So if we've got hysterical paralysis, I might be able to identify it because of lack of changes in whatever. But other than that, I think this is a very interesting space where culture really plays a dominant role. People who are suffering feel it in their bodies, but how they feel it in their bodies manifests in terms of how different cultures think about, like the Germans think everything's a little bit of heart failure, the French think it's a little bit of liver, and now I think, so that would make my comment that that's a very intriguing space, and I don't know what DSM-5 says about it.
I don't know about somatoform in particular, but just to just follow up on that, I recently read Jonathan Metzl's Protest Psychosis. Recommended read. He shows the history, at least in the 1950s on up, of schizophrenia and how the political and cultural structures of, particularly in the U.S., really shaped how schizophrenia was being diagnosed, where you had, your bored housewife in the 1950s that was not, bringing, home or bringing dinner to her husband in his slippers, and so, you must have schizophrenia. And then it became the angry African American in protest of the, white society. Well, this is the 1960s. And so if you were too angry and too violent, let's put you into, institutionalized place. And so the political atmosphere has really changed the way in which diagnoses are made and the perceptions of people without really understanding what are people experiencing, what is it like to be that person who is struggling during the civil rights movement, and not just to simply assume that person has schizophrenia. So Jonathan Metzl did a really nice work looking at Ione State Mental Institution in Michigan and just the history of that.
Peter?
Speaking of civil rights, my favorite diagnosis from a social constructive point of view, by the way, I think every disease is socially constructive and every disease has a biology, so let's get rid of that distinction, was drapetomania. Drapetomania was the pre-Civil War disease that caused slaves to run away. Talk about medicalization. But I had another point, but I've forgotten it, which is my mild cognitive impairment.
I think too, again, from some of the reading about why the DSM-5, it was hoped that with the advances in genetics, the advances in imaging, and some of the advances technologically in the neurosciences, that was going to bring forward a lot of new information that would help to undergird sort of more validity, then again, increase reliability. So I think that was kind of one of the motives that it's time to be revising. Now, generally those things have not panned out very far, but I think that was kind of some of the impetus.
And then you eliminate Rett syndrome, which then you do find the genetic mutation. Goodbye. It's out of the book.
And I can help them to figure out a way out.
Serife?
One thing that I want to address, Barbara, that you raised about research and this kind of, what I'm hearing from other panelists and from the group is that there are these research interests that, we want to, for instance, understand the genetics underlying mental disorders or neuroscientific processes, etc. And there are also like interests in care, and also someone like Ellen Francis saying, well, wait until research catches up. So I kind of want to challenge that idea a little bit, because what we would require for best research may not give us necessarily the best treatment yet. So for instance, take neuroscientific or genetic research on mental disorders. There is really, really exciting research happening, but it's still in its infancy. So for instance, there's more and more evidence coming from genetics research that yet at the molecular level we can't identify like common structures that are shared by all individuals diagnosed with the same illness. So we need to still continue doing research. And for instance, for genetics research, it might be actually helpful to individuate the symptoms, say voice hearing, and talk about look into how voice hearers at the genetic level, whether or not they are similar or not, etc. But we can't take this idea that, well, there must be a genetical connection, and common sense is that there is, but we don't have hardcore evidence yet to kind of reflect that in our treatment practices. So for now, until research catches up, or if it ever catches up, we might want to be a little bit more conservative with what we're prescribing to patients or what we are telling patients about their illnesses, because research is still in its infancy. And in order to do justice to that research and let that molecular genetic research develop or neuroscientific research develop, we need to not confuse what we need for research and with what we need for treatment.
Peter, I think it'll be the last word, because we're just about 3:15, but by all means.
No, just as a direct response to that, sometimes research is leading too much. Right. So we've got all these researchers enamored with biomarkers and genetic tests, and they're saying that's how, it's what you said, Barbara, that somehow this is what's going to be leading our diagnosis of asymptomatic Alzheimer's. So I think the social conversation between research and clinical care is a really important part of this, what we've been saying here on the panel today. So that was the last word.
Thank you. So join me, please, in thanking Julie and Peter and Serife for a very interesting panel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.